My ex-girlfriend wants me back, but I'm already someone she can never have again. I used to believe she was the one in the way only people in their early 20s do, with blind certainty and zero backup plans, the kind of belief that feels less like a choice and more like gravity, because when you're that age and someone fits into your life easily, laughs at your dumb jokes, sits beside you in silence without making it awkward, you start imagining futures without realizing how fragile imagination really is. And I met her when I was 22. Fresh out of college, broke but optimistic, convinced that love was enough to figure everything else out later. And she was the kind of girl who made ordinary moments feel cinematic. The kind who could turn a random Tuesday night into something memorable just by showing up with that half smile and asking where we were driving tonight. And most nights, we didn't even have a destination. Just empty highways, late night radio, greasy burgers and paper wrappers, cheap takeout eaten in my car with the windows cracked open because we didn't want the smell sticking around, laughing about nothing important, talking about everything important, dreams about apartments we couldn't afford yet, jobs we hadn't landed yet, kids we joked about naming someday, the way she'd rest her feet on my dashboard even though I pretended to be annoyed, the way she'd fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives home. And in those moments, it felt so obvious that this was it, that this was how people ended up together forever, not through grand gestures, but through shared exhaustion and quiet comfort. And we talked about moving in together like it was a natural next step rather than a terrifying commitment. Talked about marriage in that half-serious way where you laugh after saying it, but still secretly mean it. And I remember thinking at the time that if this was what love felt like, then maybe all the movies hadn't lied after all. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, just subtle enough that I didn't notice until it was already embedded into our daily life. Her replies getting slower, her laughter shorter, her excuses more frequent. The way she'd cancel plans last minute and say she was tired or busy or just not in the mood. And at first I told myself it was normal. That relationships weren't supposed to feel exciting forever. That comfort replaced intensity. That this was just what growing together looked like. But then came the comments, the little comparisons she never framed as insults, but somehow always landed that way. How her coworker's boyfriend surprised her with trips. How some guy she knew had already bought a house at our age. How she wondered out loud if people ever settled too early. And every time she said those things, I felt something shrink inside me. Because I didn't know how to argue against a feeling she wasn't even directly accusing me of. So instead, I tried harder. Stayed more available, rearranged my schedule around hers, apologized faster even when I wasn't sure what I'd done wrong. Told myself love meant compromise without realizing I was the only one bending. And I remember the night it finally broke. Not with yelling or slammed doors or accusations, but with her sitting across from me on my couch, hands folded, like she was delivering bad news she'd rehearsed, her voice calm in a way that terrified me more than anger ever could, telling me she needed space, that she felt like she was losing herself, that she was outgrowing the relationship, words that sounded reasonable enough that I couldn't even fight them, and I asked what I could do. What needed to change, and she shook her head and said it wasn't about me, which somehow hurt worse than if it had been, because if it wasn't about me, then there was nothing I could fix. And I watched her gather her things with quiet efficiency, watched her pause at the door like she expected me to say something that would change everything, but all I could manage was silence and a nod and a weak, okay? And when the door closed, it didn't feel dramatic, it felt empty, like someone had turned off the sound in my life. And what hurt the most wasn't even the breakup itself, but how fast she seemed to move on afterward. How quickly her social media filled with smiles that didn't include me. How easily she stepped into a life where I was suddenly irrelevant. While I stayed stuck replaying every conversation, every moment where I wondered if I should have spoken up sooner, loved differently, been more or less of something, and the nights after she left were the worst. Lying awake staring at my ceiling, phone inches from my face, fighting the urge to text her something meaningful that would magically make her come back. Scrolling through old photos like they were evidence in a case I was trying to win against reality. Doubting everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, about worth, wondering how someone could know you so deeply and still decide to walk away. And I wake up exhausted, go through my days on autopilot, answer, I'm fine. So often it started sounding believable, while internally I felt hollow, stripped of identity, because so much of who I thought I was had been built around being her person. And in the quiet moments, I finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding, that losing her didn't just mean losing a girlfriend. It meant losing the version of myself I had imagined growing old beside her, the future I had pictured without realizing how dependent it was on someone else choosing me back. And that was the night I understood something that terrified me, more than the breakup ever did. That I didn't just lose her when she walked away. I lost who I thought I was. Time didn't heal me the way people promise it does. It didn't sweep in and clean up the mess she left behind. It just kept moving forward whether I was ready or not, dragging me with it through days that felt identical and nights that felt endless. And for a long time, my healing looked nothing like progress and everything like survival. Because the first thing I learned was that missing someone doesn't disappear just because you tell yourself it should. It clings to habits, muscle memory, reflexes, like opening my phone without thinking and typing her name into the search bar before I could stop myself. Telling myself I was just curious, just checking, just wanting closure. But every time I saw her smiling in pictures I wasn't part of, every caption about living her best life, every comment from people who didn't know how much of herself she had left behind in my apartment, it felt like reopening a wound that had barely scabbed over, and I failed at stopping more times than I'd like to admit. Until one night, I realized I wasn't learning anything new anymore, just confirming the same pain over and over again. So I deleted the apps from my phone. Not dramatically, not forever, just long enough to give my brain a break from chasing ghosts. And with that space came silence. Uncomfortable silence, the kind that forces you to sit with yourself instead of escaping into someone else's life. And that's when I started pouring whatever energy I had left into work. Not because I suddenly loved my job, but because it gave me structure, something to wake up for that wasn't tied to memories of her. And slowly I stopped leaving early, stopped doing the bare minimum, stopped using exhaustion as an excuse to disappear from my own life. And somewhere in that routine, I reached out to friends I had unintentionally pushed aside while I was busy being a boyfriend. People who welcomed me back without questions, who let me talk when I needed to and let me stay quiet when I didn't. And those nights sitting on mismatched couches or grabbing drinks after work reminded me that I existed outside of that relationship, that I had a history that didn't begin or end with her. And the hardest part of all was learning how to be alone without feeling abandoned. Learning that silence didn't always mean rejection, that eating dinner by myself didn't mean I had failed, that being alone in my apartment didn't mean I was unwanted, and it was during one of those quiet nights, staring at the ceiling without the urge to text her, that the realization hit me with an honesty I couldn't escape. She didn't leave because I was a bad partner. She didn't leave because I didn't love her enough. She left because she knew I would always stay, because my loyalty was predictable, my presence guaranteed, my forgiveness endless, and people who don't know what they want often walk away from the safest place first, and hearing about her life through mutual friends only reinforced that truth. The new relationships that burned fast and disappeared, the weekends that blurred into parties, the smiling photos that felt loud and performative, happiness that looked more like distraction than peace. And for the first time, I didn't feel jealous, I felt distant, like I was observing a life I no longer belonged to, and something in me shifted quietly after that. I stopped trying to prove anything to anyone, stopped fantasizing about her regretting her decision, stopped imagining conversations where I finally said the perfect thing because I didn't need her validation to breathe anymore. I became quieter, not because I was broken, but because I was finally listening to myself. And strength didn't arrive with applause or dramatic transformation. It arrived in small moments, choosing not to ask about her, choosing sleep over rumination, choosing to walk away from conversations that drained me. And by the time I noticed, I no longer wanted her back, not truly, not the way I once did. I also realized I hadn't forgiven the past either. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I was neutral. And that neutrality felt strange, almost dangerous, because it was the first time her name didn't trigger a reaction, and that was the moment everything began to change. I didn't expect her name to show up on my phone again, not because I thought she wouldn't ever think about me, but because I had finally reached a place where she didn't occupy space in my daily life anymore. So when the notification appeared one random afternoon, casual and unassuming, just a simple, "Hey, hope you've been doing well," it felt surreal in the quietest way, like running into someone from a past life at a grocery store and realizing you no longer recognize the person you used to be with them. And what struck me most wasn't excitement or fear or anger, it was how neutral my body felt, how my heart didn't race, how my hands didn't shake, how I didn't reread the message 10 times, searching for hidden meaning, because the tone was light, almost careless, as if months of distance and silence had been nothing more than a pause in conversation. And I remember staring at the screen, thinking about how once upon a time, I would have responded instantly, overthinking every word, desperate not to say the wrong thing, but now I took my time. Finished my work, let the message sit, not out of strategy, but because it didn't feel urgent anymore. And when we eventually agreed to meet, it wasn't framed as closure or reconciliation or anything heavy, just coffee, just catching up. And when I walked into the cafe and saw her sitting there waiting, the strangest thing happened. She looked familiar but distant, like a memory sharpened by time but stripped of emotion. And as we talked, I noticed how she kept studying me, not subtly, like she was trying to reconcile the version of me she remembered with the one sitting across from her now, and she commented on it almost immediately. How calm I seemed, how grounded, how different, said it with a smile that carried both admiration and uncertainty. And I realized then that the power dynamic had shifted without either of us consciously trying to move it, because she was the one leaning in now, asking questions, searching my face for reassurance, while I listened without needing to be understood. And she talked about her life in broad strokes, the things she'd tried, the people she'd met, the places she'd been, leaving out details in a way that felt intentional, like she wanted to sound fulfilled without inviting scrutiny. And somewhere between sips of coffee, she admitted something she clearly hadn't planned to say out loud, that she compared everyone she dated to me, that no one ever quite matched the way I made her feel. And I could see the relief in her expression when she said it, like confessing a secret she'd been carrying alone. And then came the moment I had once fantasized about during my lowest nights. Her saying she made a mistake, that leaving wasn't what she thought it would be, that she missed me, not just the relationship, but me, and that she wondered if we could try again. And I listened, really listened, not for the words, but for what lived beneath them. And that's when the clarity arrived, quiet but undeniable, because what she described missing wasn't my presence in her life now. It was the safety I provided then, the certainty, the way I anchored her when she felt lost. And I realized she wasn't reaching for love. She was reaching for stability, for familiarity, for the version of herself that existed when I made her feel chosen without asking for the same in return. And as she spoke, I noticed how often her sentences circled back to fear. Fear of being alone, fear of not finding something better, fear of settling too late instead of too early. And for the first time, I saw her without the lens of longing distorting my view. I saw someone unsure, searching, afraid of the quiet she once thought she wanted. And there was no anger in that realization, no satisfaction, just understanding. And as the conversation stretched on, filled with pauses and half-finished thoughts, I felt something settle inside me, the final piece clicking into place, because the version of me she was drawn to now, the calm, self-assured man sitting across from her, didn't exist when she left. He was shaped by the absence she created, forged in the loneliness she never stayed long enough to see. And I understood then, with a clarity that didn't hurt, that the person she wanted back was someone she had unknowingly helped create by walking away. And that realization changed everything. Saying no to her was harder than loving her ever was. And that surprised me more than anything else, because I had imagined this moment so many times in the past as something that would feel powerful or vindicating or clean. But when it finally arrived, it felt quiet and heavy and honest, like setting something down you had been carrying for too long rather than throwing it away. And I remember sitting there across from her, the cafe noise fading into the background, her eyes searching mine for an answer she already sensed wasn't coming the way she hoped. And I didn't rush my words, because it wasn't a conversation meant to be won. It was one meant to be understood. So I told her the truth in the simplest way I could, that I loved her deeply when she didn't choose me, that I stayed when staying cost me pieces of myself, that I begged in ways I was never proud of because I believed love meant endurance, that when she walked away I didn't become stronger overnight, but I did become honest with myself, that I healed without her knowing, without her helping, without her waiting, and that somewhere in that healing I found peace, not happiness in the loud sense, but peace in the quiet one, the kind that doesn't need constant reassurance to survive. And as I spoke, I saw her face change, not defensively, not angrily, but with recognition, like she was finally hearing the cost of choices she once framed as necessary growth. And she cried then, not dramatically, just tears slipping down as she apologized, not once but repeatedly, for leaving the way she did, for taking my presence for granted, for coming back too late. And when she asked if there was any chance at all, any version of us that could exist again, it felt like the air itself paused, waiting for my response. And that was the moment I understood something clearly. That going back wouldn't be a reunion. It would be a sacrifice, because the life I had rebuilt was fragile in its own way, held together by boundaries I had learned to respect. And letting her back in wouldn't just mean forgiving the past. It would mean risking the peace I fought to earn. And I told her that gently, that loving her again would require becoming someone I no longer was. Someone who ignored his instincts, someone who mistook familiarity for safety, and that didn't make her a bad person or me a better one. It just meant so we had grown in different directions at different times. And when we finally stood to leave, there was no dramatic goodbye, no slammed doors or last-minute confessions, just a long hug that felt like closure rather than hope. And as I walked away, I realized something that stayed with me long after. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't holding on or letting go in anger. It's choosing yourself quietly, without applause, and understanding that love doesn't always fail loudly. Sometimes it just arrives at the wrong time and teaches you who you needed to become. The end. Alright, let me talk to you for a minute about this story, because this one hits in a way a lot of so-called breakup stories don't. What stood out to me immediately is that this isn't a power fantasy. There's no revenge arc, no sudden glow-up montage where the main character becomes untouchable and the ex comes crawling back purely to boost his ego. Instead, what we're watching is something much rarer and much more uncomfortable. Emotional maturity happening in real time. And that's why this story works. The main character isn't strong because he dominates the situation. He's strong because he doesn't. He doesn't insult her. He doesn't rewrite history to make himself the hero and her the villain. He tells the truth, even when that truth doesn't make him look perfect. He admits that he begged. He admits that he lost himself. He admits that healing was lonely and slow. And that honesty is exactly what makes the ending land so hard. The moment that really stayed with me is the realization that the version of him she wants back only exists because she left. That's devastating, because it means love wasn't enough to save the relationship, but pain was enough to reshape him. A lot of people experience that in real life, but don't have the words for it. This story gives them those words. I also appreciate how the ex isn't portrayed as evil. She's human, confused, afraid of being alone, drawn to safety once chaos stops being exciting. That's real. And the fact that the main character can see that clearly without bitterness shows how far he's come. He's not rejecting her to punish her. He's rejecting her to protect himself. That distinction matters. The ending doesn't try to shock you. It doesn't rely on twists or dramatic exits. It just quietly tells you that sometimes choosing yourself doesn't feel empowering in the moment. It feels sad, heavy, lonely, and yet it's still the right choice. That's a truth most stories avoid because it doesn't sell fantasies, but it resonates deeply. If you've ever loved someone who only realized your value once you stopped offering it freely, this story is going to sit with you. And if you're currently in the phase where you're rebuilding yourself after being left behind, this story doesn't promise you revenge, it promises you clarity. And honestly, that's far more powerful. Alright, before you go, if this story hit a little too close to home, if you felt that quiet heaviness, that growth, that moment of choosing yourself, then you already know this wasn't just entertainment, it was real. Stories like this take time, emotion, and honesty to bring to life. And the best way you can support that is simple. Hit the like button, because it tells the algorithm this kind of meaningful storytelling matters. Subscribe to the Reddiculous channel if you want more deep, emotional Reddit-style stories that don't rely on cheap drama, but still leave you thinking long after the video ends. And if you've been through something similar, drop a comment. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear next. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.